George Will, that right-wing prince of darkness, wrote in a column on Sunday this about George Bush, and this is George Will. He said, quote, "George Bush seems to have passed through the tumults of the 20th century untrammeled by any of the great passions or arguments or aspirations. In the absence of ideas," George Will says about George Bush, "mere tactics are everything." George Will hates this man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rita Moreno, legendary actress, legendary singer, legendary dancer, and a presidential campaign trail warm-up act. November 7th, 1988, the final campaign rally for Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis, held in Pauley Pavilion, Westwood Village in Los Angeles, not too far from legendary Hollywood. But enough about Michael Dukakis, and, this is hard to say, enough about Rita Moreno. That just leaves more about George Will. The Washington Post recently published a 10-page special section called A Half-Century of George F. Will, the Iron Man of America's op-ed pages. George Will's first syndicated column for the Washington Post was January 4th, 1974. The title, The New Rockefeller Commission. And, now 50 years later, the new weekly podcast. Inspired by the Washington Post marking 5 decades of reading George Will, let's mark 4 decades of hearing about George Will in this episode of C-SPAN Radio's The Weekly. Many mentions of George Will and his writing over the years on C-SPAN. Since we opened with a Dukakis for President rally in 1988, let's continue with other presidential candidates, like Pat Buchanan, another conservative columnist. Here's Pat Buchanan campaigning for president in Nashua, New Hampshire, February 1996.
Hey, speaking of the media, did any of you all see the Brinkley show this morning? You know, George Will started yapping at me like a little poodle, and I had to take the newspaper and roll it up and hit him once or twice. He was in great shape by the end of the show, though.
And Republican Rudy Giuliani, campaigning for president in Windham, New Hampshire, October 2007.
George Will wrote a column a while back that said that while I was mayor of New York, I ran the most conservative government in the United States in the last 50 or 60 years. And you'll have to ask him, but I believe what he was really referring to was fiscal conservatism. He was referring to reducing the growth of government, getting it under control, making it accountable. Aren't these things Washington needs now?
During the 1984 presidential campaign, Bruce Springsteen became an issue when Ronald Reagan, running for re-election, embraced the song Born in the USA. George Will had a role in that. Here's historian John Meacham, a favorite of President Joe Biden, in February 2020 with the backstory.
Word reached President Reagan in the fall of '84 that this song had come out, and he said this was his favorite Bruce Springsteen song, to which the White House press corps, always respectful, asked what his previous favorite Bruce Springsteen song had been. It took 3 days, and the word came back, it was Born to Run. And no one's sure whether President Reagan had actually heard that. But he was in New Jersey, was a swing state. And it was the core, remember, of what we now used to call Reagan Democrats. So the fact that a Republican was carrying New Jersey was a big deal. Bruce Springsteen came straight out of that constituency that President Reagan was trying to affirm in 1984. So he gives a couple of speeches where he says, you know, New Jersey's own Bruce Springsteen has made this patriotic song. Well, the patriotic song is about a guy getting killed at Khe Sanh and not being able to find a job. And so there was big pushback. George Will had written a column. This is how Ronald Reagan learned about Bruce Springsteen, is through George Will. That explains a lot about America. And George is the only person, present company included, who ever wore a bow tie and a double-breasted blazer to a Bruce Springsteen concert.
George Will's thoughts about President Reagan's Vice President George Bush also commanded attention, but not necessarily in a positive way. Here's Nancy Reagan biographer Kitty Kelly, May 1991.
Mrs. Reagan never liked the Bushes. She hated George Bush, called him whiny, and she was constantly having lunch with George Will. And always days after the lunches with George Will, there'd be some negative reference to the vice president in one of Will's columns. Most of you do remember that one about the tinny arf of a little lapdog. Well, that followed one of Mrs. Reagan's lunches with Mr. Will.
In July 1991, C-SPAN interviewed George W. Bush. The future president was tough on George Will because of his father.
Unfortunately, there's a bunch of these kind of, I would call them minor leaguers, who view themselves as major league writers, who attack George Bush in a personal way.
You wouldn't be talking about George Will, would you?
Yeah, there's one. I sure would. And
those kind of things hurt?
Yeah, not anymore. I don't even read the guy anymore, so I can't tell you if he's been personal or not. But when you read your father being called a lapdog by a person of his stature, I'm not sure I mean large stature or small stature, it bothers you, particularly if you're a feisty Texan, which I am. And yeah, it bothered me. It bothered me for Dad. And but I learned a good lesson from him. And in this case, for example, he just shrugged it off and kind of, you know, attributed it to smallness. And, you know, I subsequently found out, and it's probably unfair to say about a fellow like Will, but it's probably for social reasons that he has irked at George Bush. And I don't know. I don't pay attention to it anymore. But
the next year, C-SPAN again interviewed George W. Bush during his father's own presidential campaign. And again, George Will came up. Here's what George Bush said about George Will in August 1992.
What was your reaction when a bunch of conservatives called for your father to step down, including George Will? We talked about George Will the last time he appeared.
I think George Will's irrelevant to what George Bush thinks. The fact that George Will thinks George Bush ought to step down tells me nothing. And the other fella, mail artist, direct mail artist guy telling him to step down, he's irrelevant too. What matters is what the people think. The people who work for a living, the people who live out in the States, not the Beltway social gossipers, Brian, and you know that. And George Bush doesn't listen to those people. He listens to the people of America who pay taxes and who work. And those are the only ones that we try to pay attention to. So whether it be the cartoonists or the columnists or the second guessers or the people trying to make money off of politics, they don't matter to us.
But in the end, things seemed to work out okay between George W. Bush and George F. Will. Here's George W. Bush, now President George W. Bush, in the Rose Garden of the White House, May 27, 2003.
It's my honor to welcome the world champion Anaheim Angels to the White House. Congratulations. I understand some of the players were so excited that, well, like David Eckstein, who actually went out and purchased a suit. Fine looking. I don't know if David shared with the players here that I actually invited David for dinner. George Will and I hosted a baseball dinner here a while ago, and David came, and he didn't take any silverware.
Speaking of baseball, let's return to July 1991 when C-SPAN interviewed George W. Bush. At the time, he was managing general partner of the Texas Rangers baseball team.
But beyond the politician, you see...
the columnists, I forgot.
I mean, you got George Will and David Broder, and others spend... they'd rather, based on what you read, they'd rather spend time in the locker room than they would covering sport.
You bet.
I mean, covering politics.
Well, I think that's an interesting aspect of the game. The way I would describe it is it's the only game where you can have George Will sitting next to the postman, and they might be able to get along because they have a common thread, and that is discussing whether or not... you know, I don't even know who George Will's favorite team is, but whoever his favorite team is starting pitching is going to get through the mighty red machine. I think that's one of the wonderful aspects of baseball is that it can hit you at all dimensions. I can't speak for George Will because I don't follow him that closely, but I think people, for example, and perhaps this is what's captivated him. You get this sense of history in baseball.
In Congress, George Will has been cited by senators and representatives, both parties, in hearings and on the floor. Here's Republican Congressman from Illinois, Henry Hyde, July 1987, during the Iran-Contra hearings.
But there's another saying, and that's all lies are reprehensible. Some are just more reprehensible than others. For instance, we politicians, we practice what's called political hyperbole. We don't lie. We practice political hyperbole. George Will has a great phrase. He has an emancipated view of the facts.
From July 24th, 1990, Republican Congressman from California, Bob Dornan.
Mr. Speaker, I made a 1-minute speech at the beginning of today's session where I pointed out an article. I mistakenly had thought it was Time magazine, and it was Newsweek. I'd carried it around open to the article for a day, so I'd forgotten that Mr. George F. Will writes for Newsweek. Mr. George F. Will, very provocative writer, has a great gift with words and with speech. He's a regular on one of my personally viewed television shows on Sunday called the so-called Sunday shows that discuss political and current world affairs. David Brinkley's show this week, excellent show. Mr. Will is the House conservative. But more than that, he's become the House conservative for ABC, the whole network. And more than that, it seems that NBC and CBS feel that since ABC, their competitor, has a conservative on the air periodically, he can serve as the House conservative for all three networks. And thank heavens that CNN has people on like, because I believe they are a powerful fourth network now, that they have people on like Patrick Buchanan so that Mr. Will hasn't become the House conservative for all of the major electronic outlets in this country.
And from September 1994, here's Republican Senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms.
A little over a year ago, George Will wrote a very, very fine column on the question of spending limits. I've always had a personal interest in George. When I first came to Washington, George Will was a young man who agreed to serve on my staff for a few weeks. And I enjoyed having George around. And then all of a sudden, he became the token conservative columnist on the Washington Post, and he didn't need his small Senate salary. And I've been glad to see the meteoric rise of George Will in the journalism profession. He has a good head on his shoulder, and he's a thoroughly honest young man, and he deserves all the success that he's had.
For Democrats, here's Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts speaking at a November 1998 tribute to liberal columnist Mary McRory.
Mary got her big break as a reporter when she was assigned to cover the Army McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. She had a unique perspective. She laughed at Joe McCarthy, which no one had done up to that time. That's when right-wingers first started calling Mary a communist. Now they just call her a liberal. That doesn't faze Mary at all. She's never been bothered by readers who get upset by her columns. She just tells them to read George Will. They'll be much happier.
And Nancy Pelosi. On October 5th, 2005, George Will wrote a column opposing President Bush's nomination of Harriet Miers to become a justice on the Supreme Court. The next day, Democratic House Minority Leader Pelosi was asked about the Miers nomination.
And what is your general take on this split?
Interesting. It's interesting. It was interesting. I don't think George Will's going to be on the Christmas card list too long. Yeah.
On March 30th, 2006, something unique happened on the Senate floor. During debate, both a Republican senator and a Democratic senator cited the same columnist, and they quoted the same sentence in a column, and they made the same point about it, using arguments that sound familiar nearly 20 years later. The columnist, George Will. The topic, immigration. First, from Arizona, here's Republican John McCain.
I have listened to and understand the concerns of those who simply advocate sealing our borders and rounding up and deporting undocumented workers currently in residence here. But that's easier said than done, Mr. President. Easier said than done. I've yet to hear a single proponent of this point of view to offer one realistic proposal for locating, apprehending, and returning to their countries of origin over 11 million people. How do we do that? The columnist George Will quite accurately observed that it would take 200,000 buses extending along a 1,700-mile long line to deport 11 million people. That's assuming we had the resources to locate and apprehend all 11 million, or even half that number, which we don't have, and we all know won't ever have.
Then, from Nevada, on that same day in the Senate, here's Democrat Harry Reid.
It's unrealistic to think that we can round up these people and expel them. As conservative columnist George Will recently wrote in the Washington Post, and I quote, "We are not going to take the draconian police measures necessary to deport 11 million people. They would fill 200,000 buses in a caravan stretching bumper to bumper from San Diego to Alaska. That's farther, Mr. President, than San Diego to Miami. And there are no plausible incentives," he writes, "to get the 11 million people to board the buses," end of quote. Even if we could deport 11 million people, how would we? Do we want to? It would cost billions of dollars.
And Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Here's the Democrat from New York on the Senate floor, September 1997.
Let me now quote George F. Will, one of the most learned and thoughtful, entertaining, rewarding observers of the Washington scene we've had in a long time. When he's not writing about baseball, he tends to write about politics, and occasionally enters the world of such as we are now talking about. And he refers to an article, an essay published in the Wilson Quarterly, the invaluable quarterly of the irreplaceable Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The invaluable quarterly of the irreplaceable Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
That clip from Senator Moynihan is significant for another reason. Appearing on C-SPAN in November 2002, George Will called Senator Moynihan my good friend, one of the few real pinups I've ever had in politics. Senator Moynihan quoted George Will again in June 1999, speaking at a memorial for Washington Post editorial writer Meg Greenfield.
And so it would continue for the almost 4 decades that followed. First at the Reporter, Irving Kristol, then at her beloved Washington Post, which became her whole life, while she in turn became part of the life of the nation. She was true. She was fair. The potent measuredness, as George Will has put it, there was none like her.
George Will's connection to Meg Greenfield was noted by Washington Post editor Ben Bradley. He appeared on C-SPAN in April 1993.
You did ABC This Week with David Brinkley for a while?
For 20 minutes, until I found out, I figured out what my role was supposed to be, which was to attack George Will and get attacked by George Will. And that is not what I was put on this earth to do, so I quit.
What did you have with getting George Will started anyway in the first place? Weren't you there when he started the Post?
Well, yes, but Meg Greenfield had hired him. He was an aide to some senator, Gordon Allett, I think, from Colorado, and he worked for her, not for me.
Before the Washington Post, there was George Will's stint with the National Review. From November 1986, here's National Review managing editor Priscilla Buckley.
George Will, of course, was always brilliant, and but we were the first people who published him regularly, and it was because of the columns he wrote for us that the Washington Post picked him up, and then Newsweek, at which point we could no longer afford George Will.
And along the way, George Will inspired other conservative thinkers and writers, like Yuval Levin. Here's the current director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, when he appeared on C-SPAN's Q&A program in June 2013.
I was drawn to the intellectual side of conservatism probably in high school. If there's a moment, it would be when a good friend of mine named Adam Kuyper gave me a book by George F. Will called Statecraft to Soulcraft, which I probably would have been about 16 or so. And it's not too much to say that it changed my life. I mean, it opened me up to a way of thinking about politics that I didn't quite know I was searching for. And, I've never stopped reading that book.
Have you told George Will that?
I did tell him that. He was, I think, flattered by it. He also said that he doesn't agree with everything in that book anymore, which you can kind of see in his writing, too. But, you know, more than the specific arguments of the book, although I probably agree with more of them than he does these days, the way of thinking, the way of approaching politics in a way that's grounded in philosophy and in history, that takes politics seriously as a human endeavor that's really about finding the truth and finding the best way of life, it appealed to me enormously, and it continues to.
To be sure, George Will has had detractors. We go to the March 1996 Radio and Television Correspondents' Dinner. The featured entertainer, no-holds-barred radio talk show host Don Imus. No one in the media was spared from his sharp-edged barbs and cutting insults, including George Will.
And then there's George Will, and they call Steve Forbes a geek. Anyone that buttoned up, I guarantee you, is spending part of his weekends wearing clothes that make him feel pretty. Things he's picked up, we now know, at Victoria's Secret over in Georgetown.
And then there's Oliver Stone, the conspiracy-minded movie maker appearing at the National Press Club January 1992 to discuss his conspiracy theory movie, JFK.
One might ask of the journalists who have suddenly emerged as the defenders of history, what is their sense of history? How much work has the sage of Bethesda, George Will, done in the 20 years he has been a columnist to try to uncover the answers to some of the dark secrets in Dallas, 63.
One footnote to Oliver Stone's assertion, George Will actually lives in Chevy Chase, Maryland, not Bethesda. And Christopher Hitchens, another iconic political writer, appearing on C-SPAN's Book Notes, September 1993.
This is called A Pundit Who Need Never Dine Alone.
That's George Will.
George Will.
Yes.
And you start off here by saying, study and ponder the following lines written by George F. Will as Ronald Reagan went tottering back to his California estate in 1989. And then you go on to lambast him for writing what you said is basically unintelligible.
Well, I think George Will's stuff is very affected and overwritten, yes. It's full of, I think, rather bogus shows of learning and classical tags and things of this kind. I have a weakness sometimes for quotations of that sort myself, so I think I recognize the disease in others, and it's in a very advanced stage in his case. But I think he's a courtier. I think especially during the Reagan era, he basically was making a living as a professional flatterer of the Ron and Nancy court. And I think I don't think journalists should do that. I think it's even more important not to do it when your friends are in power.
Speaking of
what's wrong with it?
Yeah.
Well, I think for one thing, it'll congest your style very badly. You'll be full of things you can't really say, things that are half confidences that have been given to you by people in power. Your stuff will start to puff up. Your paragraphs will start to get rotund with all the things you could say if you really wanted, but you can only hint. That's bad. It's bad intellectually, and I think it's bad morally. It means that you become, your contract is no longer with your readers.
But Chris Hitchens did respect George Will for one thing, writing columns. From October 1997, a panel about political writing.
I hate to agree with George Will about this, or indeed about anything else, indeed. But the truth is, yes, there's nothing like not writing for making you unhappy. And if you have the compulsion, then the only problem that you'll have as you surrender to this compulsion more and more is that you'll find that it gets harder the more you do it. Now, that seems a shame. It should get easier. It should become more like a facility, for example. But
after begrudging appreciation from Christopher Hitchens, we'll end by hearing from William F. Buckley. In the Washington Post special section marking George Will's 50th anniversary as a columnist there, Mona Charen wrote that George Will was Bill Buckley's rival for America's most influential conservative pundit. Here's William F. Buckley appearing on C-SPAN's Book Notes, October 1993.
Which ones did you enjoy the writing part of it the most?
This is going to annoy you, but I really don't like to write. It's terribly hard work. That may be one reason why I have managed to develop the facility to write quickly. If I had the same kind of languorous pleasure in writing that my younger brother has, or that, say, Eudora Welty has, who just gets up with a light in the eye saying, my God, this is the day in which I write, then I could answer your question with a greater sense of hedonism. You know, George Will once said to me, I write 3 times a week. When I wake up in the morning, the first question I subconsciously ask myself is this the day in which I have to write a column? And if the answer is affirmative, I wake up bright and happy. It happens exactly the reverse with me.
William F. Buckley made a similar observation in December 1996.
Writing is, for some people, including me, excruciatingly painful because you're using your entire nervous apparatus. And so if you have a column to write or an essay or a book review, you're burning up a lot of stuff that would prefer to be idly sitting around reading a nice book or essays by other people. Now, I know that this isn't universally the case. My dear friend George Will told me once, he said, when I wake up in the morning, before I'm completely awake, I ask myself the question, is this a day in which I have to write a column? And if the answer is yes, I wake up happy. Mine is exactly the opposite reaction. If it's a day in which I want to come, I wake up unhappy until it's done.
And now, a bonus clip. One person we haven't heard from in this podcast about George Will is, well, George Will. So, now it's his turn. George Will has made 64 appearances on C-SPAN. Lots to choose from. Let's go with this one. From a June 1994 roundtable of political historians, and in context of what you heard from William F. Buckley, here's George Will.
How do you do this business? How much time do you spend thinking about communicating?
I write all the time. It's a metabolic necessity for me. A lot of writers I find, I don't know what you find, a lot of writers hate to write. They like the research, they like thinking about it, they like the end product, the book or the column or something with their name on it, but the putting words down, they hate. I love it. To me, it's more fun than anything. It's a tactile, physical pleasure. And I'm not one of those who despairs about the printed word. I think book sales are strong and robust. I believe that the book still is the primary carrier of ideas.
You can find your own favorite George Will moments on C-SPAN by using the C-SPAN video library. Among those 64 appearances, Washington Journal, Q&A, book notes, book TV, panels, speeches, American history, even programs about baseball. The C-SPAN video library even has the famous 1978 firing line debate on the Panama Canal treaties. The debate included several people you've already heard from and about in this podcast. Ronald Reagan, William F. Buckley, Patrick Buchanan, even the father of Senator John McCain, Admiral John S. McCain, plus George Will. The 2-hour debate is said to have influenced the subsequent Senate debate on the treaties, and also Ronald Reagan's electability as president 2 years later. Introducing George Will, here's Democratic Senator from North Carolina and a famous towering figure from the Watergate hearings, Sam Ervin.
Then one of my favorite commentators on the Washington scene when I was in the Senate, George Will, who wrote such a nice article about me. I've got it among my most precious souvenirs. And he's a great commentator who's known for his stand for fundamental things.
And remember, that was a Democrat. That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly. For now, thanks for listening and happy searching.